A single ceramic coffee mug sat exactly in the center of the kitchen island. Beside it was a dark wool coat, folded with terrifying precision. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken glass, no overturned chairs. To the untrained eye, it looked like a woman had simply stepped out for a morning walk and forgotten her belongings. But when the behavioral analysts walked into that room, they did not see a peaceful scene. They saw a signature. They saw a meticulously crafted message left by an offender who was entirely in control. How does a perfectly centered coffee cup tell a profiler everything they need to know about a predator? How do two mundane objects reveal the exact psychological makeup of a kidnapper before a single suspect is even named? The answers lie in the dark and clinical world of criminal profiling, where every microscopic decision made by an offender paints a portrait of their mind. Before we decode the twisted logic of the kidnapper and uncover the chilling truth behind this disappearance, make sure to hit subscribe to Tracking Evil with John, so you never miss an investigation. We are diving deep into a case that forced investigators to look beyond the physical evidence and peer directly into the psychology of an obsession. The investigators knew immediately that they were not dealing with a crime of opportunity. The placement of the mug was deliberate. The folding of the coat was a ritual. These were not the frantic actions of a panicked criminal rushing to escape a scene. These were the calculated steps of someone who felt entirely at home in the space of the victim. They were dealing with an organized offender, a classification that strikes dread into the hearts of even the most seasoned detectives. This predator did not just want to take the victim. He wanted to demonstrate his absolute dominance over her environment. He wanted to show the authorities that he was smarter, faster, and infinitely more patient than they could ever hope to be. The quiet perfection of that kitchen was a taunt. It was a promise that the nightmare had only just begun, and the profilers knew that. Finding the victim would require them to think exactly like the monster who took her. Nancy Guthrie did not live a spontaneous life. Every single day was a carbon copy of the one before it, dictated by a schedule so rigid it bordered on obsessive. She woke up at exactly 5:30 in the morning. She spent exactly 45 minutes exercising in her living room, followed by a 15-minute shower. By 6:30, she was in her kitchen, brewing a specific brand of dark roast coffee. She left her apartment at exactly 7:15, walking the exact same route to her job at a local architectural firm. She crossed Elm Street at the same traffic light every single morning, bought a newspaper from the same vendor, and sat at her desk by 7:45. Her colleagues often joked that you could set your watch by her movements. If Nancy was at the water cooler, it was 10:15. If she was packing her briefcase, it was exactly 5 o'clock. But this extreme punctuality was not just a quirk. It was a foundational pillar of her existence. She found comfort in the predictable rhythm of her days. In a chaotic world, her schedule was her armor. She believed that as long as she followed her own rules, nothing bad could ever happen to her. She never varied her walking route to enjoy the scenery. She never stayed late for impromptu drinks with coworkers. She never left her apartment without ensuring every lock was secured and every appliance was unplugged. Her life was a masterpiece of control. She meticulously planned her grocery runs for Sunday mornings at 8, knowing the aisles would be empty. She scheduled phone calls to her mother for Tuesday and Thursday evenings at precisely 7:30. She was a woman who left absolutely nothing to chance. But there is a fatal flaw in living a perfectly predictable life. When you never change your patterns, you become entirely visible to anyone who is watching. You hand over the blueprint of your existence to anyone patient enough to study it. To her friends and family, the routine of Nancy was a symbol of her reliability and dedication. They saw a woman who was focused, driven, and thoroughly organized. But to someone lurking in the shadows, that same routine was something else entirely. It was a menu of opportunities. It was a precise timetable that dictated exactly where she would be, what she would be doing, and how long she would be vulnerable. Her armor of predictability was actually a glowing target on her back. Every step she took at exactly the same time every day was not keeping her safe. Each perfectly timed movement was just another piece of data being collected by an unseen observer. Her meticulously structured life was slowly becoming a perfectly designed trap. Each repetitive action was drawing her closer to an intersection with a predator who appreciated her punctuality just as much as she did. Each predictable moment was simply a countdown to the inevitable. Every meticulously planned day was building toward a terrifying climax that she could never have anticipated. The fracture in her perfect timeline occurred on a crisp Tuesday morning in November. At 7:30, the newspaper vendor on Elm Street looked up, expecting to see Nancy approaching the corner. She was not there. At 7:45, her desk at the architectural firm remained empty. By 8:15, her supervisor felt a creeping sense of alarm. This was a woman who had never been a minute late in 5 years of employment. A missed morning was not just unusual for Nancy, it was entirely unprecedented. Her supervisor called her apartment, but the phone rang endlessly, echoing in an empty room. By noon, the concern had metastasized into genuine panic. Her mother, who had not received her scheduled morning phone call, contacted the local police department. When the officers arrived at her apartment complex, they found her car parked in its usual assigned spot. There were no signs of forced entry at her front door. The deadbolt was unlocked, which was the first screaming anomaly. Nancy never left her door unlocked. When the officers stepped inside, the eerie silence of the apartment washed over them. The air was still, carrying the faint scent of fresh coffee. And there, in the center of the kitchen island, sat the lone ceramic mug, full of cold, dark roast. Beside it lay her dark wool coat, folded with an unnatural, pristine symmetry. Her purse, containing her wallet, identification, and cash, was still resting on the entryway table. Her keys were still in the dish by the door. Everything was exactly where it belonged, except for the woman who owned them. The initial responding officers were bewildered. There was no blood, no scuff marks on the hardwood floors, no overturned furniture to suggest a struggle. The apartment was immaculate. It looked exactly as it should on any given Tuesday morning, right up until the moment Nancy usually put on her coat and walked out the door. The timeline presented a terrifyingly narrow window. She had brewed her coffee at 6:30. The vendor realized she was missing by 7:30. Sometime within that single hour, inside a locked apartment building with neighbors on all sides, Nancy Guthrie simply ceased to exist. How does a person vanish into thin air during their morning routine without leaving a single trace of violence behind? Who could possibly bypass her security, intercept her before she left, and remove her from the premises without causing even the slightest disturbance? The sheer lack of evidence was the most chilling evidence of all. It meant the perpetrator was not a clumsy burglar who panicked. It meant the perpetrator had planned this extraction with military precision. They knew her apartment layout, they knew her schedule, and most terrifyingly, they knew exactly how to make her leave quietly. The pristine nature of the crime scene suggested a level of control that pointed to a highly sophisticated threat. A chaotic struggle would have left clues, but the absolute stillness of the room offered nothing but terrifying questions. The first 48 hours of a missing persons investigation are the most critical. Statistics dictate that the chances of a safe recovery plummet drastically as the clock ticks past that 2-day mark. Law enforcement agencies immediately established a command center, assuming they were dealing with a classic kidnapping scenario. They tapped her phone lines. They monitored her bank accounts for any sudden withdrawals. They waited with bated breath for the inevitable ransom demand. They braced for a phone call from a desperate criminal looking for a massive payout in exchange for her safe return. But the hours agonizingly stretched into days. 72 hours passed, then 96. The silence from the kidnapper was deafening. There were no demands for cash. There were no cryptic notes left in mailboxes. There were no shadowy figures caught on camera trying to drain her savings. The total absence of financial motive completely shattered the initial investigative theory. This was the moment the local authorities realized they were completely out of their depth. If this was not about money, then the terrifying reality of the situation began to set in. They requested immediate assistance from federal behavioral analysts. When the agents arrived, they reviewed the pristine crime scene photos and the glaring lack of a ransom note. The lead profiler stood in the center of her kitchen, staring at the exact spot where the folded coat had rested. He delivered a chilling verdict that changed the entire trajectory of the hunt. This was not a kidnapping for ransom. This was a targeted abduction by an organized offender, driven by a deeply ingrained psychological obsession. The perpetrator did not want her money. He wanted her. He had likely been watching her for months, learning every intricate detail of her life, until he felt he possessed her completely. The abduction was merely the final stage of his twisted fantasy. This revelation plunged the case into a far darker territory. They were no longer looking for an opportunistic criminal. They were hunting a meticulous predator who viewed Nancy not as a hostage, but as a prize to be collected and kept. The realization that she was in the hands of a highly organized, obsessive individual meant the danger she faced was immeasurably higher than anyone had initially feared. If you are fascinated by how investigators profile organized offenders and decode criminal behavior, drop a like on this video. The investigation now had to pivot entirely. They had to stop looking for a criminal seeking a payday and start hunting for a ghost who had seamlessly integrated himself into the shadows of her life. They needed to understand the mind of a stalker who was patient enough to plan a flawless abduction and disciplined enough to leave absolutely no physical trace behind. They were searching for someone who operated entirely in plain sight but remained completely invisible to the world around him. The behavioral analysts immediately began to construct a psychological profile of the unknown subject. They turned their attention back to the only pieces of evidence the kidnapper had left behind: the coffee mug and the folded coat. To the local police, these items were just personal effects. To the profilers, they were a loud, arrogant declaration of the personality of the offender. According to the lead behavioral analyst, the way the coat was folded was highly significant. It was not just tossed onto the counter. It was aligned parallel to the edge of the island, the sleeves tucked perfectly underneath. This level of exactness reportedly indicated an offender who suffered from severe, obsessive-compulsive tendencies. He required absolute order in his environment. The fact that he took the time to fold the coat of Finn, the victim before abducting her, showed a terrifying level of comfort and control at the crime scene. He was not rushed. He was not afraid of being caught. He was acting out a script he had rehearsed countless times in his own mind. The profilers concluded that the suspected kidnapper was likely a male in his late 20s to early 30s, living alone and working in a highly structured profession like accounting or data entry. He would appear entirely normal to the outside world, perhaps even overly polite and meticulous. He would drive a meticulously clean car and maintain a spotless home. But beneath this veneer of extreme normalcy lay a deeply disturbed and controlling psyche. The analysts theorized that he had first noticed Nancy because her own rigid routine mirrored his internal need for structure. He did not choose her randomly. He selected her because she fit perfectly into his twisted worldview. The investigation team began a grueling process of tracing backward from the moment of the abduction. If the alleged offender had been stalking her, he had to have been present in her environment. Investigators relentlessly canvassed the route she walked to work every single day. They interviewed the newspaper vendor, the crossing guards, and the baristas at the cafes along Elm Street. They were looking for anyone who fit the profile: a quiet, observant man who was always present but never truly interacted. They pored over weeks of surveillance footage from traffic cameras and storefronts, painstakingly searching for a recurring face or a specific vehicle that repeatedly appeared in the background of her life. The behavioral unit emphasized that this type of offender would not have approached her directly before the abduction. He would have preferred to watch from a safe distance, documenting her habits, noting her vulnerabilities, and slowly building a fantasy where he was the central figure in her life. The deeper the investigators dug into her daily routine, the more they realized how easily someone could have mapped her entire existence. They discovered a small coffee shop across the street from her architectural firm, with a clear line of sight to her desk window. According to the manager, there was a man who came in several times a week, always sitting at the same table by the window, always ordering a black coffee, and always staying for exactly 1 hour. He matched the physical description the profilers had theorized. He was quiet, unassuming, and intensely focused on the building across the street. The investigators felt a surge of adrenaline. They had a potential suspect who perfectly aligned with the behavioral profile. They believed they were finally closing in on the organized offender who had stolen Nancy from her perfectly structured life. But just as the task force prepared to move in and identify the man in the coffee shop, a new piece of evidence surfaced that completely shattered their entire timeline and threw the carefully constructed profile into absolute chaos. The breakthrough that derailed everything came from a discarded transit ticket found 3 blocks away from the apartment complex. Detectives had been operating under the ironclad assumption that the victim vanished between the hours of 6:30 and 7:30 in the morning. This belief was entirely anchored by the presence of the freshly poured beverage and the neatly arranged outerwear. But the transit receipt told a completely different and far more sinister story. It was time-stamped for 11:45 the previous night. Surveillance footage from a nearby municipal camera, which had previously been ignored because it fell outside the established temporal window, was urgently reviewed. The grainy black and white video reportedly showed a vehicle matching the description of the victim exiting the underground garage of her building precisely at midnight. Who do you think fits the profile? Now let me know in the comments before we reveal the truth. The man in the cafe across from the architectural firm was immediately brought in for questioning. Within 2 hours, his alibi was verified with airtight precision. He was an auditor who simply liked the view and had never spoken a single word to the missing woman. He was a phantom suspect, an illusion created by circumstantial proximity. The investigation task force realized with a collective shudder that they had been successfully manipulated. The immaculate crime scene was not a snapshot of an interrupted morning. It was a carefully constructed diorama designed to deceive law enforcement. The behavioral analysts returned to the drawing board, their initial framework fractured. If the morning departure was staged, it meant the offender had not just breached her physical sanctuary, but he had actively impersonated her daily habits. He had boiled the water. He had poured the dark roast. He had meticulously positioned the garments to buy himself an 8-hour head start. This revelation elevated the psychological profile from a mere obsessive spectator to an active, predatory orchestrator. The level of forensic countermeasures deployed indicated an alleged perpetrator possessing intimate knowledge of police procedures. He understood that a missing person report would not be filed until she failed to appear at her workplace. By staging the morning sequence, he ensured that investigators would focus their initial, crucial efforts on the pedestrian routes and daylight hours, completely ignoring the cover of darkness. The entire city had been searching for a ghost in the morning sun while the true horror had unfolded under the midnight moon. The profilers had to ask themselves a terrifying new question. How did the suspect know the exact layout of her belongings well enough to stage a perfectly convincing morning departure without triggering any alarm from neighbors? The answer pointed to a horrifying reality. The predator was not watching her from across a busy street or a crowded intersection. He was watching her from inside her own supposedly secure environment. He had to be someone with unfettered, unquestioned access to the internal architecture of her life. He was someone who could bypass the heavy security doors, navigate the silent corridors, and slip into her private space without forcing a single lock. This drastically narrowed the suspect pool from the general population of the city to a terrifyingly small circle of individuals. The investigators demanded employment records, maintenance logs, and keycard swipe data from the property management company overseeing the residential complex. They were no longer hunting a stranger in a crowd. They were hunting a wolf dressed in the sheepskin of a trusted neighbor or an invisible employee. The tension within the command center reached a breaking point as thousands of digital access logs were printed and cross-referenced. Every contractor who had fixed a pipe, every security guard who had walked the perimeter, and every resident who lived on her floor was subjected to intense scrutiny. The analysts were looking for a specific anomaly, a digital footprint that matched the psychological signature of a man who needed absolute control. They sought an individual who worked unsociable hours, allowing him to observe the nighttime rhythms of the building without drawing attention. The task force commander ordered a complete blackout of information to the press. If the stalker was someone embedded within the community, he was likely watching the news broadcasts, monitoring the progress of the police, and adjusting his strategy accordingly. The silence from the authorities was a tactical move designed to make the offender believe his deception was still working. They needed him to feel comfortable. They needed him to slip up just once. The digital forensics team worked continuously for 48 hours, tracing every electronic signal emanating from the building on the night of the disappearance. They were searching for the digital equivalent of a footprint in the mud. And finally, buried deep within the automated logs of the electronic keycard system, they found a discrepancy that defied all logical explanation. A master maintenance key had been swiped at the side entrance of the building at 11:15 that night. Subscribe to join our true crime community as we break down these psychological puzzles every week. The master key belonged to a 42-year-old overnight maintenance technician who had been employed by the building for exactly 3 years. He was a quiet, unassuming man who painted walls, repaired HVAC units, and moved invisibly through the hallways while the residents slept. His employment file described him as exceedingly reliable but socially isolated. The behavioral analysts immediately recognized the absolute synchronization between this individual and their revised psychological framework. He was the invisible man they had been hunting. The profilers realized that his position granted him the ultimate vantage point for an obsessive predator. He had access to the master key codes. He knew the location of every security camera and, more importantly, he knew their blind spots. He possessed the ability to enter any apartment under the guise of emergency repairs, allowing him to study the layouts, the personal items, and the intimate spaces of the residents without ever raising suspicion. The investigative team quietly obtained a warrant for his basement office and his personal vehicle. What they discovered inside that subterranean workspace solidified the darkest theories of the behavioral unit. Hidden beneath a false floorboard in a utility closet was a cache of meticulously organized photographs, journals, and personal artifacts. But these were not random items. They were a comprehensive, deeply disturbing archive of the victim. The suspect had not just been watching her. He had been documenting her entire existence with clinical precision. The journals detailed her exact arrival times, the brands of groceries she purchased, and the specific cadence of her footsteps above his workspace. The profilers found entries describing the exact temperature she kept her thermostat and the specific scent of the fabric softener she used. He had used his maintenance access to slowly, methodically infiltrate her reality. The realization that hit the detectives was sickening. The perfectly arranged outerwear and the precisely centered beverage cup from the crime scene were not just a staged morning routine. They were a physical manifestation of his journals. He had arranged the scene not just to fool the police, but as a final, arrogant display of his absolute mastery over her life. He knew exactly how she left her belongings because he had secretly stood inside her living room dozens of times while she was away at the architectural firm. When tactical teams apprehended the alleged offender in the boiler room of the complex, he offered zero resistance. His demeanor was chillingly calm, devoid of any surprise or panic. He sat in the interrogation room with perfect posture, his hands neatly folded on the metal table, exuding the exact organized control the profilers had predicted from day one. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not demand to know why he was being held. He simply waited, observing the detectives with the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist studying insects. The lead interrogator placed the photographs from his hidden archive onto the table, expecting a reaction, a crack in the facade. Instead, the suspect reportedly smiled a thin, hollow smile. He confessed to the abduction with a terrifying lack of emotion, detailing the events of that midnight breach as if he were reciting a technical manual. He explained how he had disabled the corridor camera, bypassed the deadbolt with a duplicate key he had milled himself, and surprised her in the dark. He confirmed the revised behavioral theory perfectly. He had spent over an hour staging the apartment, ensuring every detail aligned with her habits, before removing her from the building through a service elevator. The psychological puzzle was complete. Every assumption made by the behavioral unit regarding his need for order, his spatial dominance, and his pathological patience was verified in horrifying detail. The twist that the entire true crime community found so deeply unsettling was not just who he was, but how easily he had weaponized his mundane profession. He did not need to be a mastermind hacker or a wealthy criminal to execute a flawless abduction. He just needed a gray uniform, a keyring, and the terrifying patience to wait in the shadows of a place where the victim felt completely safe. The illusion of security within a gated, locked community was permanently shattered by the revelation that the predator was the very person tasked with keeping the building running. He had successfully manipulated the entire command center into looking outward, while the true threat had been nesting comfortably in the subterranean levels all along. His confession was a masterclass in psychological horror, proving that the most dangerous predators do not break down doors, they simply use the keys we hand them. The answers were all there, locked inside the mind of a man who believed his ability to organize chaos gave him the right to consume another human life. The swift conviction of the overnight technician brought a grim sense of finality to the legal proceedings, but it offered very little peace to the community. He was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never again walk freely among the public. The courtroom was entirely silent as the judge read the verdict, the air thick with the heavy realization of the destruction caused by a single, unchecked obsession. The prosecution utilized the behavioral analysis reports not just as supplementary evidence, but as the core narrative of their case. They demonstrated to the jury how the seemingly innocuous actions of a maintenance worker were actually the calculated steps of a predatory escalation. The defense attempted to argue diminished capacity, suggesting the defendant was lost in a delusion. But the meticulous nature of the staged crime scene completely negated any claim of disorganized thought. The jury returned their guilty verdict in less than 4 hours. Yet, even as the heavy steel doors of the maximum security penitentiary closed behind him, a profound sense of unease lingered over the lead investigators. The behavioral science had been flawless. The profile had perfectly matched the offender. The forensic countermeasures had been successfully decoded. But the ultimate victory felt entirely hollow, because one agonizing question remained completely unanswered by the suspect. Despite hundreds of hours of interrogation and endless psychological evaluations, the convicted killer adamantly refused to disclose the physical location of the victim. He maintained a sadistic silence regarding her final resting place, hoarding that single piece of information as his last remaining shred of control. He had lost his freedom, his privacy, and his hidden archives, but he retained the ultimate power over the grieving family. The authorities conducted massive excavation, operations based on the mileage logged on his vehicle and cellular tower pings from the night of the crime. They searched state parks, abandoned industrial sites, and deep bodies of water, but the landscape yielded absolutely nothing. He had utilized his intimate knowledge of the municipal infrastructure to ensure she would never be discovered by conventional search methods. His refusal to speak transformed a closed legal case into an open psychological wound for everyone involved. The perfectly organized offender had disposed of the evidence with the same terrifying precision he used to manipulate the initial investigation. The case officially moved from an active manhunt to a cold recovery mission. The lead profiler, who had so accurately dissected the mind of the killer, noted in his final report that this withholding of information was the ultimate expression of the pathology of the suspect. He did not consider the victim to be a person with a family who deserved closure. He viewed her as a possession, and he was determined to keep her hidden away from the world forever. The brilliant deduction that solved the timeline and broke the false alibi could not overcome the sheer stubborn cruelty of a man who treated human life as a collectible item. The investigators were left with a chilling reminder of the limitations of their science. You can map the exact dimensions of a criminal mind, you can predict their movements and categorize their desires, but you cannot force a sociopath to show empathy. The architectural firm eventually hired a replacement. The apartment was cleaned out and rented to a new tenant, who knew nothing of the history within those walls. The city moved forward, but the invisible scars left by the phantom maintenance worker permanently altered the way people viewed their own security. Every resident in that complex now double-checks their locks, suddenly intensely aware of the master keys hanging on the belts of strangers passing in the hallways. The resolution of the legal battle provided justice, but the absolute absence of a physical recovery left a gaping void that no court document could ever seal. The haunting reality is that true closure remains entirely out of reach. The gavel had fallen, the prison sentence was enacted, and the files were stored in the archives, but the story refused to end. The silence of the perpetrator ensures that the nightmare continues for those left behind, frozen in a perpetual state of agonizing uncertainty. What this case teaches us about the illusion of domestic security is fundamentally terrifying and demands a complete reassessment of our personal safety protocols. The traditional legal system is entirely reactive, designed to prosecute a physical trespass or a violent assault only after the boundaries have been explicitly breached. But psychological stalkers operate in the gray area of implied authorization. This offender did not break in. He used a key he was legally issued, exploiting the systemic trust we blindly place in service personnel. From a behavioral science perspective, the critical lesson here is learning to identify the subtle indicators of covert surveillance before it escalates into physical capture. The evidence proved that extreme predictability is a severe vulnerability. If your daily transitions can be charted on a spreadsheet with absolute certainty, you are inadvertently providing a tactical advantage to anyone observing you. We must understand that safety is not simply a locked door or a gated community. True security requires dynamic variation in your routines and a hypervigilance regarding the individuals who exist on the periphery of your life. The individuals who possess the structural authority to access your environment must be viewed through a lens of analytical skepticism. This investigation highlights the desperate need for stricter auditing of master access logs and rigorous psychological screening for those holding the keys to our private sanctuaries. The law focuses on the act of the crime, but criminal psychology teaches us that the preparation for the crime is where the true danger gestates. Recognizing an organized predator requires us to stop looking for obvious monsters in the shadows and start examining the quiet, meticulous individuals who blend seamlessly into the background of our daily existence. Recognizing these early warning patterns is the only viable defense against an enemy who uses your own habits as a weapon against you. The behavioral sciences successfully mapped the darkest corners of an obsessive mind and identified the exact perpetrator hiding in plain sight. But the chilling reality remains that profiling can only catch the killer. It cannot force a sociopath to surrender his ultimate prize. The system worked exactly as it was designed to, securing a life sentence and permanently neutralizing a highly organized threat to society. Yet, the absolute silence of that hidden grave proves that sometimes the monster still wins the psychological war long after the handcuffs are locked. A perfectly folded garment and a centered cup of coffee will forever stand as a testament to the terrifying patience of a predator who lived inside the walls. What happens when the person tasked with protecting you is the very danger you are trying to keep out? Consider that the next time you hear the sound of heavy footsteps echoing in the empty hallway outside your door. If you want to explore another case where the evidence completely defied logical explanation, click the video on your screen right now. Stay safe, stay intensely vigilant, and I will see you in the very next deep dive investigation.